The US leads the world in a lot of things. One we're not so proud of, America also leads the world in obesity, by far. Now, we're libertarians, not health specialists, so take our input with a grain of salt or cinnamon or whatever you want. But we do specialize in analyzing economic incentives, and there's only one conclusion about food subsidies. Twinkies and Froot Loops are good for you. Just kidding.
Subsidies, they've been studied extensively, and they have one main result, and that is they encourage farmers to grow more food. So they promote overproduction of food. Overproduction has led to cheap prices, particularly for ultra-processed junk foods, and those contribute to weight gain and healthcare costs and all kinds of other things.
For real, let's start with a look at the ingredients in Twinkies. Put that in your back pocket for now, and let's get into what is an agricultural or food crop subsidy exactly, and how do they work?
I'm Vince Smith. I'm a professor of agricultural economics at Montana State University, and for the last decade have directed the American Enterprise Institute's agricultural policy programs. So there are these three different types of ways of giving farmers more money for a crop. One, a direct payment based on historical production. Two, a payment that it gives you an incredibly good deal on your insurance policy to protect you against crop losses. That's what I've called the inverse Las Vegas world, where the house is going to pay you a lot on average. Now, the house in this case is, again, you and I, the taxpayer. And three, a hidden subsidies that exist because government regulations alter what would otherwise be free market outcomes.
The house pays you? Now we're talking. So how did Las Vegas get inverted?
Farm policy started in 1862 when President Lincoln signed I think it's called the Morrill Act. The USDA's mission was to facilitate the development of better technologies and to improve agricultural production. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 is the watershed legislation signed by FDR, of course, that authorized attempts by the government to provide additional income to farmers. Another watershed piece of legislation that established what has been called the loan price program. It says, here's a minimum price at which the government will effectively, through some tricky stuff, buy any crop that you want to sell them.
Moving on, what foods or crops are most heavily subsidized?
My name is Marion Nessel. I write books about food politics. I'm about to publish my 15th. It's called Slow Cooked: An Unexpected Life in Food Politics. Well, subsidies are complicated. They pay farmers if they get into trouble. And now it's grown into something that mostly helps the largest agricultural producers in the United States. That means corn, soybeans are the main ones where farmers are guaranteed to make money no matter what they do because the government steps in and helps them.
The government is putting its thumb on the scale, distorting the free market in favor of those crops. How do you think that works out for consumers?
They promote overproduction of food. They encourage farmers to grow crops in places where they really shouldn't be growing those crops, corn in areas where there's not much rain, for example, because they know that the government is going to step in the end and take care of any losses that they have if they can't sell the product at what it costs them to produce it. The subsidies encourage farmers to grow as much food as they possibly can. And we saw in the United States that the number of calories available in the food supply per capita went from 3,200 in the early 1980s to 4,000 20 years later. And that's twice what the population needs.
And now this was totally unpredictable, right? Food companies naturally did two things. Before we get to those two things, if you're finding this video interesting, don't forget to hit those like and bell buttons. Okay, so first,
they put food in places where it never was sold before, made food available absolutely everywhere in very large amounts. Every bookstore has a cafe in it now. And it used to be that you couldn't bring food into anywhere near a bookstore. They got really upset about it. They made you check it at the door because they didn't want you ruining the books or spilling coffee on something. But now it's accepted that you're going to be eating in places where nobody ever ate before. So food is available everywhere. There's plenty of evidence that if food is in front of you, you'll eat it. And it's there to encourage people to eat more food, not less.
second, they started using more of the subsidized ingredients.
They're the ingredients in processed foods. So, corn is in absolutely everything. It's corn chips, for example, or corn oil, or any of those things. It's in absolutely everything. And as is soybeans. I mean, the protein from soybeans is in absolutely everything. You go and look at ingredient lists of products and you see it over and over and over again. So the kinds of things that people can't stop eating are processed cereals, cookies and cakes, and what the U.S. Department of Agriculture loves to call grain-based desserts. Chips of any kind, fast food products, I mean, things that everybody loves eating.
Guess what the common denominators are in all of those foods?
There are three major crops that get 70% of the money in total put out under this program, and that's averaging about $6 billion a year over the last several years, are corn producers, wheat producers, soybean producers.
Ever notice how after eating corn, well, you see it again later? Yeah, that hard to digest grain is by 3 times the most heavily subsidized crop in the US. Corn syrup is used in soda. Margarine is made from hydrogenated corn oil. Corn is even processed into drinking alcohol.
The soy and corn ingredients and the seed oil ingredients go into processed foods. And there is now, 800 studies that demonstrate that people who eat ultra-processed foods have worse diets, take in more calories, have more obesity, more chronic disease, and are at greater risk for COVID-19 than people who don't eat those foods.
And let's not forget everyone's favorite, that white, addictive, heavily subsidized drug, the one that also creates alcohol and is called dextrose, fructose, maltodextrin.
Sugars probably have 50 different terms that are allowed on food labels. My favorite is fruit purees. High fructose corn syrup is another form of sugar.
Consumption of sugar has been growing and growing along with our waistlines since the low-fat craze of the 1980s.
What the food industry immediately did was to take the fat out of its processed foods and put sugars in instead. And this was called the Snackwells phenomenon, because Snackwell's cookies came out with one that had no fat, and it was advertised across the front of it, no fat, but it had the same number of calories. So the calories came from sugars, in part because the Food and Drug Administration had done a very, very big study about sugars and health, and that study came out saying sugars were no problem except for dental decay.
Now you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, I'll avoid junk food and just stick to meat, chicken, and dairy. Not a bad idea. But wait, there's more. Now's the time to stop watching if you don't want us to ruin food for you forever. Sorry, but the truth hurts. Go ahead, we dare you to close the tab. Still there? Okay, here goes nothing. Take a wild guess what crop accounts for 95% of the diets of livestock, cattle, and poultry in the US. And which crop provides the protein for the animals we eat, whose milk becomes our dairy products, whose eggs become our omelets? And take a wild guess what's happening to those animals.
Well, they're getting fatter. I mean, one of the great observations is that cats and dogs, the pet cats and dogs, have as their most serious health problem that they're overweight, and have exactly the same diseases that humans do: type 2 diabetes, heart disease, problems with osteoporosis and arthritis and so forth.
The government isn't just making people fat, it's making animals fat and less healthy overall, which, by the way, means they require more antibiotics. To be clear, health is individual. Some people's bodies might actually digest corn well. And again, we're not health specialists. You eat whatever you darn well please. But research and experiments are pouring in, especially around sugar, industrial seed oils, and the balance between omega-3 and omega-6 fats. The trend is undeniable. It's not looking good for the food the government nudges us toward. But at least these subsidies are helping farmers who wake up at the crack of dawn and work their hands to the bone and are still poor. Wait, hold up.
Ironically, the 2% of farm families that fall below the federal poverty line get almost nothing. On average, they get, I think it is $11 a farm. If you're in the lowest 10% of farms, you get $11 per farm out of the federal crop insurance program. If you're in the top 5%, you're at over $250,000 a farm in terms of subsidy in that program. But the policies put in place in the 30s still exist. So the interesting question is, why are we writing checks to farmers today, even though there might have been a justification for checks being written to farmers or help being given to farmers by the federal government during the Great Depression?
Before you lose all hope, there are food companies and restaurants making every effort to provide healthy meals and snacks. But subsidies make their jobs tougher than they should be. What challenges might a health food company face because of the subsidies for corn, wheat, soybean, and sugar?
Well, I think the big one is that their ingredients will cost more if they're not using those things. And price is a big issue in food choice, especially for people who don't have a lot of money. I mean, that's one of the great ironies of the current food system, is that people who don't have money find it cheaper to buy their calories from ultra-processed junk foods than they do from fruits and vegetables, which are relatively more expensive. Their prices have gone up much higher than that of the subsidized junk foods. So people without money don't have the choice of eating more healthfully. And they are the ones who have higher levels of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and are at greater risk for COVID.
The increase in obesity and decrease in overall health, both in the animals we eat and in humans ourselves, especially among the poor, is the natural outcome of the incentives established by government subsidies.
There are almost, at least for the interest groups who are lobbying for a particular program, there are almost no unintended consequences. The consequences are fully intended, and the focus is fully on the benefits to special interest groups.
Those consequences are also fatter people who eat ever-increasing quantities of food that's increasingly designed not to nourish, but to keep us hungry.
There's an old advertisement for potato chips saying you can't eat just one. And that's what you're aiming for. You want people not to be able to stop eating them.
We'll readily admit, the farms and food companies the government props up are, in a way, just feeding us the oily, fried, sugary, processed foods we crave.
Junk foods do not exist because we subsidize wheat, corn, and so on. Junk foods exist because they, to many people's palates, taste good.
But the reason what we crave is so cheap and overabundant in the food supply is because it's heavily subsidized.
We should be outraged. You and I and everybody else who isn't getting the checks should be outraged by current farm subsidies.
Food is one of life's greatest pleasures. And all of this fuss about it, if it takes the pleasure away, that's really a shame.
Here's your homework. Find something the government subsidizes that is good for us, or our four-legged friends. It's not an impossible task, but it ain't easy. Post what you find in the comments. We guarantee it won't be Twinkies and Froot Loops.